Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to take a brief look into the futuristic world of the Ares project by first-time designers Jeff and Brian Engelstein. In the Ares project, 2 to 4 players compete through strategic card-driven combat in order to both terraform and colonize the planet Mars. There are 4 factions in the game, each of which has its own deck of cards, buildings, upgrades, attacks, and special powers that lend particular strengths and weaknesses to those factions. And because of this, the Ares project can best be described as a card game simulation of the popular real-time PC strategy games like StarCraft and Command & Conquer. And similar to those mentioned games, players in the Ares project will be sending their secret forces out to scout, disrupt, and ultimately attack each other's bases in an effort to either annihilate the opposition or to collect the most points at the game's conclusion. At its heart, the Ares project is mostly a simple game to play, but there are many interesting features and facets that need to be learned in order to be competitive, especially since each faction is truly unique of one another. And due to this, the game includes 2 different versions, the base game and the full game. Now, for the purposes of this review, I will not be going into a full-blown walkthrough of the game because there is a lot to take in and initially teach, but I will spend some time on the overarching mechanics of the game so that interested players may decide if this is the right title for them. But before we do so, let's briefly look at the game's components and setup. The heart of the Ares project is each faction's unique deck of cards. Cards in the game basically have 2 uses. If they are placed face up in front of a player, then they will produce whatever is shown on the facing of that card, such as buildings that can produce one of 2 specific types of units, or combat utility cards that can initiate battles that are resolved with the game set of dice. But if a card is placed face down, then it will instead count as a generic resource which will later be used to construct those same buildings and units. Each faction likewise has 1 or 2 starting buildings that are pulled from each player's deck at the start of the game and placed in front of that player during the game's setup. Also included are 4 unique base mats for each of the 4 factions, all of which contain important information regarding that race's special abilities or places to hold its special units. However, these will only be used in the full game and not the base game. There are also 4 types of units in the game represented by tokens that match each of the 4 factions' combat options, which include infantry, armor, air, and buildings. During the course of the game, these unit-specific tokens will be placed on a face-up building card for each unit that is constructed through the expenditure of a player's resources. Also during the full game, power tokens will be used to represent a player's energy, which in turn are spent in order to activate special abilities or construct specific units within the game. In order to represent the secrecy of each player's strategic choices during the game, all of these tokens, units, and building cards are hidden behind a player's faction screen that represent that player's base. Players will play their cards secretly behind their screen into their base, and only during certain points of the game, mostly of which are during attacks, will they reveal their bases and units to their opponents by removing the screen. Now, as I previously mentioned, the objective of the game is to either conquer the opponent's base or to collect the most victory points at the game's conclusion by controlling and holding what is called the frontier. The frontier board is what represents this contested area that each of the players are fighting over, and is initially not controlled by any of the warring factions. When it is taken over by a faction, that player's control token will be placed on the frontier, removing the control token of the opposing player if one is present. And other players will mostly seek to destroy each other's bases through the game. Control of the frontier is equally as important because it is the main way to earn points needed for victory if the goal of base destruction becomes too difficult for the players. The final 2 pieces that I'm going to discuss are the rules. As I previously mentioned, there are 2 sets of rules for the Ares project, those being the base game and those for the full game. The base game is fairly easy to pick up, but really only serves as an introduction to the full game, which really needs to be digested and learned in order to best appreciate the game's theme and mechanics. And because of this, each faction has a separate rulebook that explains the special rules that apply only to them, most of which take precedence over the main rules. And we'll discuss this a little later in the review, but let's briefly touch on the gameplay. The Ares project is mostly a game for 2 players, with an optional rule for the addition of a 3rd and 4th player, but I wouldn't recommend that until players have a firm understanding of both the basic and full game rules. There's a lot to take in, so I'm going to just briefly touch on the game's mechanics and rules. Gameplay in the Ares project alternates between players, and on a player's turn they will play one and only one card from their hand. In most instances, a card will either be played as a building or as a resource on a building to produce those given units. However, attack cards may also be played, at which time the players will then have to battle at a set location determined by the attacker, being either the frontier or the opponent's base. Now, there are rules that determine where a battle can and cannot take place, as well as those units that may and may not participate, such as those units with the deep strike ability or turrets that can only defend your base and may never go on the offensive. And players will need to be mindful of their strategic options when it comes to which units they wish to build and which they would rather turn into resources. When a battle does take place, the players will then construct their forces starting with the defender. To construct, the defender will first remove their screen and produce any units they wish by removing resources off of their buildings according to that unit's cost. Now, when this is done, the player will place a unit token on that same building for each of the units that they constructed. When the defender is done with all of their construction, the attacker will then likewise remove their screen and follow these same exact procedures. Battles in the Ares project are handled with dice and done in rounds of 3 to 6, depending upon which type of strike was initiated by the attacker. During combat, units are lined up against one another through a set of rules and can be manipulated by things like advanced scouting and the number of total participating units. Again, combat is resolved through the game's set of dice, which is determined by rolling and hitting targeted units depending upon a unit's strength versus that particular unit type it is targeting, of which some units are simply stronger versus other types of units. The depth and scope of the Ares project is really quite extraordinary for what is essentially a fairly easy game to actually sit down and play once you know the rules. And although I didn't spend a large amount of time poring over the mechanics in this video as I have in others, I can say that they are mostly streamlined and fairly quick to absorb. However, when introduced to the actual full game, some players may react more apprehensively due to the sheer amount of information to digest for each of the game's 4 different factions. Because of this, the Ares project reminds me of 2 other recently released 2-player games entitled Earth Reborn and Labyrinth, where the games themselves were both fun and highly cerebral, but required 2 similar-minded individuals with a very vested interest in learning the game's subtleties to be effective with each of the game's races. Therefore, my biggest concern with the Ares project isn't the actual gameplay, which is done quite well, but the learning curve that is required to truly appreciate everything that the game has to offer. And due to this, the game will probably not hit the table often at my house because I know that my biggest gaming partner, which is my wife, won't want to spend the time reading through the faction rulebook to learn how to play it effectively or at all. Having said that though, I still very much enjoy playing the Ares project for the game that it is, which is a deep, highly strategic gamers type of game that completely appeals to my video game roots. There's not many games out there that have been able to simulate the feel of a real-time strategy game, which makes the Ares project all the more appealing to me. I just wish it were a bit more approachable to a wider audience. And if that is my only real complaint, then I'm fairly positive this is a game that will be appreciated by a larger group of gamers than just myself. So that is the Ares project. I am Jeremy Salinas, and thank you very much for watching.